During any military conflict, cruelty against other human beings is inevitable. Torture, rape, and summary execution are as common as combat, and the victims of these crimes are in most cases innocent civilians. During World War II, some of the most vile acts perpetrated by humanity were seen. But today we will not be talking about those committed by Germany or Japan, but by other countries, whose dark actions are perhaps not as well known. We are talking about the Soviet Union and the United States. Although they wanted to hide it, the men of both armies were guilty of undeniable crimes. Among them was the rape of tens of thousands of women in revenge against the Axis forces, even though they had never held a weapon. Little is said about these acts today, but they must not be forgotten. That is why today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the most terrible abuses of the Soviet Union and the United States.
Also meine sehr konservative und vorsichtige Schätzung geht von 860.
My estimate, and it's conservative, sums up to about 860,000 cases of rape.
Der Fall war, ich gehe von den
The crimes of the Soviet Union are undoubtedly the best known of those committed by the Allied countries. The bloodlust of its leader, Joseph Stalin, was undeniable and had begun long before the first bullet of World War II was fired. It was he who, in the 1930s, ordered the massive political purges within his country that wiped out anyone who might pose a threat to his rule. This included rival members within the Communist Party, army officers, intellectuals, academics, ordinary civilians, and even members of ethnic minorities such as Ukrainians and Kazakhs. No one seemed to be safe. Often the families of the persecuted also fell along with them. The fate of the prisoners was in most cases the gulags, as the forced labor centers scattered throughout the Soviet Union were called. These were brutal places, where food was scarce and beatings by guards were a daily occurrence. Hygienic conditions were terrible, making it easy for epidemics to spread, and exposure to the weather, whether winter cold or desert heat, claimed thousands of victims. People who were sent to the gulags were forgotten by society, knowing that the hope of ever seeing them free again was very low. But sometimes Stalin's secret police did not even bother to lock up those captured. It is believed that approximately 2 million Soviets were killed during the purges, the vast majority of them by firing squad. Sometimes, if the person was of political relevance, he was first subjected to a public trial, where the sentence was already clear. It always ended with the defendant being sentenced to death. Several of Stalin's allies ended up being betrayed by him, as happened, for example, to 2 secret police chiefs. Not even his allies were safe. By 1938, the Great Purge, as these dark years came to be known, began to subside. On the one hand, the Soviet leader had succeeded in eliminating all those he saw as threats to his rule. On the other, he could see that a new danger was brewing, but this time it was external to his nation. By then, Adolf Hitler was comfortable in power in Germany. His armies had been rebuilt and modernized, his economy was strong, and a huge portion of the population shared his intolerant ideology. Everything was in place for the beginning of his campaign of territorial expansion. Stalin was aware that the Führer saw the people of his country as inferior to the Aryan race, and that he wanted to conquer their lands. He sought to make common cause with other enemies of the Germans, such as the United Kingdom and France. But at that time, the rulers of these countries preferred not to provoke Hitler. This, in addition to his own imperial ambitions, led him to take a drastic decision. Just a week before the start of one of the most massive military conflicts in history, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. This agreement guaranteed peace between the two nations, but it was also a way of dividing up Eastern Europe, with an eye to the conquests that were to come. Now allied with the Nazis, nothing seemed to be able to stop Stalin. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union also attacked its neighbor. Attacked on 2 fronts by vastly superior forces, the Polish army was quick to sign its surrender. The country was divided in 2, with the eastern half remaining under Russian control. Just as he had done on his own soil, Stalin began his campaign to pacify the territory and prevent armed uprisings. Nearly 200,000 soldiers and policemen were taken prisoner of war, but civilians, mostly artists and intellectuals, were also captured. Most of them were taken to Soviet gulags, but they were also placed in concentration camps set up in Poland. Conditions there were just as terrible as those in the Russian camps, and many died from mistreatment and poor conditions. Stalin's secret police interrogated the prisoners of war harshly, often resorting to torture. The aim behind these procedures was to decide whether the person in question could be persuaded to take a position in favor of Soviet occupation. To do so, they had to denounce their government and its policies and unconditionally accept communist control of their country. Many eventually gave in to the pressure and harassment of Stalinist agents, but others stood firm. These men were added to a blacklist. Their fate was assured.
Stalin and 6 members of the governing Politburo in Moscow signed an order on the 5th of March 1940 to execute 25,700 Polish nationalists and counter-revolutionaries, as the Polish prisoners were termed. Why? The reasoning was to wipe out the core people who created and maintained Polish culture, to eradicate the people who would resist Stalin the hardest.
Those selected were government administrators, army officers, journalists, teachers, writers, common criminals, and simple workers. With their hands tied, they were forced to kneel on the ground. Then, without a shred of judgment, they were shot in the back of the head one by one. There was nothing they could do to prevent their tragic end. If they tried to escape, the Soviet soldiers simply shot them, and they joined their executed comrades. The killings continued for weeks, with mass graves filling up to such an extent that the corpses had to be stacked 12 rows high. The Katyn massacre, as this vile act came to be known, remained a secret for years. It was only after Hitler broke his pact of aggression with Stalin and invaded Soviet territory that this dark war crime came to light. This treacherous attack took place on June 22, 1941, in what became known as Operation Barbarosa. Although the dictator knew that his alliance with the Führer was temporary, the scale of the German moves took him by surprise. Without time to mobilize his troops, he was forced to give up thousands of kilometers to the Nazi war machine, suffering millions of casualties. In every city or town they took, the Germans carried out terrible and cruel acts against civilians or captured soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of people were executed, and entire villages were wiped off the map, destroyed by fire and explosives. The cruel massacres against their people, however, motivated the men and women of the Red Army to fight fiercely against the invaders. By early 1943, after the long and bloody Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviets managed to reverse the course of the war and were able to take the lead. Now, it was the Germans who were forced to give up the conquered territories. Stalin's soldiers were quick to take revenge on the Nazis and their allies for the brutalities committed against their population. The Germans knew that being captured by the Soviets was almost a death sentence. Of the approximately 91,000 men captured after the battle at Stalingrad, for example, only 5,000 ever saw their homes again. Many were sent to the gulags, and many others were shot on the spot or hanged on makeshift gallows. But the victims were not only Germans. A special hatred was held for Nazi collaborators, that is, Soviets who offered their help to their captors in exchange for avoiding concentration camps or death. In many cases, these were members of minorities who had been persecuted by Stalin's regime, such as Ukrainians, although there were also deserters from the Red Army. The Soviets considered them traitors to the fatherland, and only death was a proper fate for them. Tens of thousands of prisoners of war died in this way, executed or imprisoned in the gulags. But this was not the end of their killings. In 1945, the Russians invaded Germany and began to exact their revenge on the civilian population. Every town or city they passed through suffered constant looting, abuse, rape, and murder by the bloodthirsty Soviets. For them, the line separating civilian from military was non-existent. They were all Nazis, and therefore deserved savage and cruel treatment. When they reached Berlin in April of that year, the Führer's situation was totally critical. His best units had already fallen, and only divisions made up of children or elderly people without any combat experience remained. Ammunition and explosives were scarce, and most of his vehicles had been destroyed. Knowing that defeat was the only possibility, Adolf Hitler took his own life. However, the death of the German leader did not calm the unbridled Soviets. They were still seeking revenge for the atrocities committed in their homeland. For weeks, Berlin suffered the brutal fury of the Red Army. The few houses that survived the artillery assaults were looted and burned. Any civilian risked being accused of being a collaborator or an undercover Nazi, and summary executions occurred daily. German women, meanwhile, were constantly subjected to rape by soldiers, whose superiors looked the other way or even encouraged this behavior. It is believed that around 120,000 Berlin women were sexually abused during the battle and the subsequent occupation of the Reich capital. Thousands of them, traumatized and shamed by these experiences, would end up resorting to suicide.
They came every night into our basement, to all the basements. They just took their boots, and we were all bedded down. All the men in the front, the woman in the back. By then I was in my 9 months pregnancy, also close to having my child. And they kicked with the boot, Frau komm. That's the only German word maybe they knew, Frau komm. And then the person had to get up, the woman, and they didn't take her outside the basement. They put her against the wall, and they stood in line with their machine gun pointing at us and raped the woman.
While Berlin was where these crimes were most savage, similar experiences occurred across much of the German territory invaded by the Soviets. While many of the rapists were said to have been tried and convicted, there is little evidence to support this. The vast majority likely never suffered the consequences of their actions. After the war, rapes and other abuses by the Red Army, which had been kept secret, were brought to light. This was largely due to the new conflict that began as soon as the Axis forces signed the surrender between the United States and the Soviet Union. Uncle Sam no longer saw Stalin's subjects as allies, and they looked for every possible way to tarnish his reputation. They did not need to go to great lengths because, as we saw in the video, the Soviet leaders' hands were far from clean. But the Americans' hands were not clean either, although that is what they wanted the world to believe. Throughout World War II, they committed crimes as cruel as those of other participating nations. This was very common, for example, in the Pacific Theater of Operations, fighting against the Japanese. American officers and soldiers saw the Japanese as little more than animals. Added to this was the savagery with which the Asians fought, often preferring to die or commit suicide rather than surrender, which only increased the animosity of the Americans. The few prisoners who fell into the hands of Uncle Sam were frequently tortured or even executed for no reason other than revenge. It was also very common to mutilate those who fell in combat, taking war trophies such as fingers, teeth, ears, noses, or skulls. Sometimes they also did this with those who were still breathing. Decades later, when the bodies of Japanese soldiers fallen on the Pacific Islands were repatriated, approximately 60% had been decapitated. Of course, as is common in wars, the atrocities did not only affect the combatants. During the occupation of Japanese islands such as Okinawa, the Americans often subjected the locals to brutal torture and abuse. This was done as a form of retribution against the Japanese soldiers. Houses were ransacked, men beaten, and women raped. In one Okinawan village, 3 Americans made weekly visits looking for the most beautiful young women. When one was chosen, she was taken into the hills and repeatedly abused. The number of victims on this island alone is believed to have reached 10,000. Women, out of shame, often did not report the crime to the military police. When they did, they were generally completely ignored. After Japan's surrender, the situation did not change. The Americans became occupying forces and continued to abuse the civilian population. In just 10 days, 1,300 rapes were reported in Kanagawa Prefecture. To prevent this from continuing, the new Japanese government established numerous brothels where soldiers could legally have sex. These places, however, held a dark secret. Many of the women were minors, and many of them had been forced to work there by the police. Thus, under a facade of legality, the rapes continued. In Europe, the story was not much different. Just as with the Japanese, many Germans taken prisoner were killed by the Americans. Other times, soldiers had direct orders from their superiors not to capture the enemy. It did not matter if the German was surrendering, he had to be shot on the spot. It is believed that well-known generals, such as George S. Patton, were among those who gave these directives.
D-Day begins in the early hours of June 6, 1944, and almost at once war crimes are being committed. On that first day at Omaha Beach, there were reports of some 130 German POWs overall. Yet just about 60 of that number were delivered to the collection points. The greater part by then had been shot somewhere along the way.
These acts were also committed in retaliation for the inhuman brutalities discovered in the Nazi concentration camps. When the Americans liberated Dachau in April 1945, they found a gruesome scene. 40 railroad cars filled with approximately 2,000 corpses rotting in the open air, all murdered by the Germans. Many of the Allied soldiers were Jewish, so they felt the crimes against their people firsthand. It is not clear how it happened or who was responsible, but after all the guards and staff of Dachau, which had peacefully surrendered, were rounded up, the bullets began to fly. Approximately 50 Germans were shot by the Americans. Although superiors later acknowledged the illegality of the act, no one was brought to trial. To this day, the liberation of this camp remains a matter of controversy. Some believe that although it constitutes a war crime, the actions of the Americans were justified because of the inhumanity of the German guards towards the prisoners in these centers. For others, nothing can excuse the killing of an already defeated enemy. Of course, in Europe, rape by this force was also very common. During the campaigns in Germany, it was not uncommon for the Allies to enter a house, capture a woman, and sexually abuse her. The reasons were the same as those used by the Soviets: thirst for revenge. The number of victims is estimated at approximately 11,000. This also happened on French territory, with those accused of collaborating with the Nazis. The cases numbered in the thousands, although they were less tolerated than those against German women. Several perpetrators were convicted and sent to prison for these acts. However, many officers were consciously unaware of the crimes of their subordinates. Since fraternization with women in the invaded territories was prohibited, one commander went so far as to say that copulation without conversation is not fraternization. This gave his soldiers tacit permission to abuse at their pleasure, and they did.
A woman who told of a rape by a Red Army soldier could expect some degree of acceptance or empathy. Whereas a woman who said she'd been raped by a GI was fairly often labeled as one of those who would throw themselves willingly at the Western occupiers.
As you have just seen, the two countries that ended up being the most powerful powers after the war committed atrocious crimes against civilian populations. The abuses of the Soviet Union are better known, but not more terrible than those of the United States. Everyone has innocent blood on their hands, and most of the perpetrators were able to live to the end of their days in peace and tranquility. That is why these acts must not be forgotten, and they must be condemned. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what do you think about the executions of the Dachau guards? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.